Thank you all for joining our session today entitled Forestry in the USA, Opportunities for the Corporate Investor. Investing in forestry, no matter how, is a critical move right now. My name is Bob Isler, and I am your moderator today. I am the founding director of the University of Georgia Langdale Center for Forest Business. I have 51 years experience in forest operations. Our first panelist is Bettina von Hagen, who is co-founder, CEO, and board chair of EFM in Portland, Oregon. Next is Keith Balter, managing director, economic research, HNRG, a Manulife investment management company in Boston, Massachusetts. And then Yasik Siri, who is Stuckey Professor of Forest Economics and Taxation at the University of Georgia, Langdale Center for Forest Business. As your moderator, I will collect questions you post online. Each panelist will tell us a little bit about themselves and their organizations, and we will start with Bettina.
Excellent. So I'm very happy to join this conference from the West Coast, where the sun is just rising. You can see the darkness behind me. I look forward to catching up with all of the good discussions you have been having during my night. And I am so pleased by the focus on biodiversity and forests in the context of addressing climate change. Investing in forests is a unique carbon sequestration strategy, which you know because you're here at this conference, because of its strong co-benefits, not only for biodiversity, which is the focus here, but also for water protection, recreation, protection of scenic vistas, and most importantly, its close relationship to rural livelihoods and to indigenous and tribal land rights. And we created EFM in 2004 exactly with this wide embrace of forests in mind, to invest and manage forests, to store additional carbon, to protect and enhance habitat for aquatic and terrestrial species, to enhance both the quality and quantity of water, while producing timber and non-timber products and creating jobs and opportunities for rural communities, for cultural harvesting, and for tribal land repatriation, all within a framework of continually improving forest health, resilience, and diversity. And we now have 130,000 acres under management in 4 Western states in 3 commingled funds, and have now expanded our business to encompass separate accounts, purchasing and managing land for a single client to accomplish their financial and impact objectives. And we also advise clients on natural climate solutions globally with a focus on North and South America. We developed the first voluntary carbon project in the Pacific Northwest of the United States 10 years ago, and now have a number of carbon projects in development, including a strategic partnership with Nike to offset the emissions associated with their outbound shipments as part of Nike's net zero commitment. And I'm grateful to Warren and team for arranging this conference and the invitation to appear on this panel.
Thank you, Bettina. Keith?
Thank you, Bob. I'm Keith Balter, Director of Economic Research for the Timberland and Agricultural Groups at Manulife Investment Management. Our parent company is Manulife Investment Management, is a major financial institution in insurance and in wealth management and investment management. In terms of the timberland and agricultural groups, we have basically $15 billion in assets under management. And in terms of our forestry presence, we basically have over $11 billion of assets under management. These are spread internationally across North America, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Brazil. We've been in the timberland management business dating back to the mid-1980s, so we have really depth and experience there. In terms of the economic research team that I head up for timberland and agriculture, we do market analysis for supporting our acquisitions and property valuations. We basically provide analysis and support for our forest and farm operations, develop communications with clients, and overall investment strategy for our business units. Thank you.
Okay, Yahtzee.
Well, thank you, Bob, and welcome everyone. What we do here at the Center for Business at the University of Georgia, we work on developing and applying what we do forest investment science, which is basically the development and application of science-based principles to forest management and forest investments worldwide. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, thanks to all of our panelists. So Bettina, I'm going to start with you. And I have a question that relates to the different mechanisms that corporate investors have available to invest in natural climate solutions in the U.S. So could you tell us what some of those are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think first I'd just like to acknowledge, I think what most of this audience already knows, that natural climate solutions are an absolutely integral part of a portfolio of strategies to address climate change, but that clearly the first step for a corporation is to establish science-based targets and to seek emission reductions, within their own direct and indirect operations. And then natural climate solution comes in as the critical last step to offset those emissions that can't be reduced internally or only at great cost or can only be reduced over time. So, once sort of that plan has been established, there's a few different mechanisms that a corporation or an entity can do to invest in natural climate solutions. I think when one is just starting, the first step might be purchasing carbon credits through a broker, through an advisor, and to assemble a portfolio of carbon projects, through those relationships. That, like any portfolio, really seeks to diversify across project types and project risk and geography. And I think this is an opportunity for the entity to select projects that speak, to their key objectives around not just offsetting emissions, but also advancing biodiversity or indigenous land tenure or empowering women or whatever other specific objectives speak to them. I mean, that's the beauty of natural climate solutions, as I mentioned, I think in my introduction, is that forests are this portal in which you can achieve carbon sequestration, but also you can address water security, indigenous land tenure, you can empower women, you can create new products and services. It is a very big tent, and it really allows, I think, an entity that's interested in using natural climate solutions to not only address the emission reduction, but also to address a number of other strategic objectives and also strategic geography, a place where they have operations or a place where they have strategic interest. So I think step one, as you're entering this field, is to choose from the variety of brokers and advisors that can help assemble that portfolio. I think the other avenue, if you want to go further, once you have developed some familiarity and sophistication with the market, is to work directly with a carbon project developer, a forest landowner, an indigenous community to develop a custom carbon project, as we at EFM did with Nike, for example, and are doing with other corporate partners. And this helps stimulate the market even more. You're developing new projects. And it can also be advantageous to the project because you are receiving, greater financial benefit from the project. It's not, while it's very important to maintain that infrastructure, that universe of brokers and advisors, definitely there's more financial benefit if you can go directly, have a direct relationship with the corporation or with the carbon buyer. The other thing that this allows a corporation to do is there's a lot of concern in the market about rising prices for carbon. Prices have increased depending on which market you're looking at, whether regulatory or voluntary markets, anywhere from 30 to 100%, over the last 6 to 12 months. And I think there's a lot of concern for those that have an obligation to meet their net zero targets about what's going to happen with prices in the future. So, developing these direct relationships is an opportunity to work into that purchase contract some different price mechanisms which protect the buyer, from significant price increases, but also allow. There's many ways to structure that provide parity and meet objectives for both the project developer, landowner, and for the corporate buyer. And then I think I'll leave this one, but I'll just mention it, and then we can talk about it, I think, a little bit later. The next step in the progression would be to actually purchase forest land directly and participate not just in the carbon stream, but in other benefits and services from forest land. And I'll leave that, I think, for a future question and stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Bettina. A recognized advantage of the U.S. timber investment is the depth, the diversity, and the strength of the underlying markets. What are the prospects for those markets going forward? And as part of that question, we've got a really good question from the audience that will follow up on your answer, and I'll pose that one to you also, but I'll let you go ahead and get started on the first one.
Hey, thank you, Bob. Well, the U.S. and Canada are very large producers and consumers of solid wood products, lumber and wood panels that are used in construction, furniture, flooring, as well as paperboard, packaging, printing, writing papers, and tissue. All products that really depend on timber resources. And these markets in the US and Canada are highly efficient. We have world-class mills and transportation and distribution systems. And the outlook for these markets over the coming decade is quite robust. And that's based on very strong positive fundamentals, particularly in the key residential construction area. US housing activity currently is at the highest level since 2007. And the outlook for housing remains positive through at least the mid-2020s. And this is supported by solid demographics. We have the millennial generation just entering the housing markets at this point. We have very low inventories of housing, and that's really reflected in very tight markets, rising home prices, and this is really broadly across the US and Canada. And we're also seeing changes in behavior. People's behavior that has been triggered by the COVID pandemic. The fact that more people are working remotely, they have more need for home space for that. With the social distancing that we experienced during COVID, people are more focused on home activities. There's more ability to shift your housing from urban areas that are high cost to lower cost, more accessible suburbs and rural areas. And we're just definitely seeing more attention paid to families and their home living spaces. So overall, Bob, I think prospects looking out ahead are quite good.
Well, thanks. So, Keith, this is going to be right in your alley, because I know you follow this question that I'm about to pose to you, and this is from our audience. The NCREIF Timberland Index posted a 9.17% return for 2021. Was this a blip or the start of a sustained period of higher returns for U.S. timberland?
Bob, I would say that really that you're looking at that really strong performance in 2021 in terms of timberland, really to sort of follow through as we go into the 2020s. And this is really a return to a more historically normal level of returns associated with timberland. Over the past 10 years, we've seen very disappointing and really sort of depressed returns associated with timberland for a number of reasons. And a key one there has been really sort of the extended period of weak housing markets in the United States. And that has really contributed. There's been other factors too. Another one is a real overhang of mature inventory on the US southern forests, which are really sort of the number one supply region in the US and actually sort of one of the top ones in the world. And just as I said, there's very good prospects for underlying markets, for demand, and overall, as we look over this coming decade. In addition to that, we're also seeing a sort of coming into balance between demand and supply in that southern supply region. We've had a tremendous amount of investment in new expanded capacity, particularly in terms of the higher value solid wood products like lumber and wood panels and engineered wood products in the US South. And we're seeing actually expanded capacity at existing mills, at greenfield mills, still in the pipeline. And that expanded capacity, that higher levels of demand are going to have impacts over the coming years. So I think that what we saw in 2021, where we saw the sort of overall total returns pushing up into the high single digits, is probably going to have legs that are going to carry into the mid-decade at least.
Thanks so much, Keith. I'm going to turn the screen just a slight bit because I have a question for Jacek. How do you measure the environmental benefits of forestry projects in the U.S. And beyond, such as carbon sequestration, carbon offsets, and in particular, biodiversity?
Thank you, Bob. I think that's a real challenge. Carbon markets are very heterogeneous. We have a lot of carbon offsets projects with very varying attributes, and I think for investors it makes it difficult to evaluate various opportunities. And I think if we were able to develop a more standardized projects, that would be quite helpful. The measurements of biodiversity or the impact the project has on biodiversity is probably even more complex. I think that we can describe what will be done as part of a project, but it's really difficult to establish what will be a real world environmental impact. And I think that sort of points to the gap between asset management and environmental impacts. And I think moving forward, the investment universe and community probably have to have a closer look into those and see how those impacts can be measured, ranked, and streamlined in the investment process.
Okay, thank you so much, Jacek. And Keith, you wanted to add something.
Just respond to Jacek that I definitely see the difficulties and the sort of need for better comparable metrics in terms of biodiversity. But Jacek, don't you think that we are seeing much more standardization and a movement to really codifying the carbon sort of measurements, and to sort of having a real framework out there that is moving to standardization in terms of assessing carbon benefits associated with a project?
Yes, I completely agree. I think that much more progress has been done on the carbon side, but still the process, and hopefully in not too distant future, we will be achieve that goal.
Okay, and Bettina, did you wish to add to that?
Yeah, I think I was going to support Keith's comment that I think there has been 30 years of work on carbon standards. And while there may be differences between ARB, which is a California regulatory standard, and European standards, and some of the voluntary systems like VERA and ACR, these are robust systems that have each systematically addressed, the primary concerns or quality aspects of carbon projects, such as permanence and leakage and so on. They may approach them in different ways, but I think it's good. I think it would be very helpful to know sort of the process that those standards go through in being developed. The methodologies of ARB or the methodologies of VERA, for example, go through a multi-year process of stakeholder engagement, public engagement, expert review, really addressing these quality concerns. And so while there may be differences among standards, just as there are differences among many products that we acquire, I don't see that as I see it as an evolving market. You do, I think to Jasek's point, you do have, like, for example, the Carney Task Force that's really looking at developing an underlying quality standard that gives sort of greater comfort in the market, because I definitely can see the point that if you're buying something that you can't touch and feel, like a ton, of carbon dioxide equivalent, you really need to be very robust in terms of those standards, because you can't use any of the other senses to evaluate the quality. So I want to support Jasek in of course the market needs to evolve further, but I also want to support the notion that there has been a lot of work on standardization and on quality. And I think I would just really encourage anybody who has concerns about that to really delve into the methodologies and review the process that has been associated. But for most of the standard methodologies, they have been through a lot of both expert opinion and public review and product testing. So I think the carbon market standards and methodologies are at a evolving, but I think mature level of development.
Okay, so we've got a question from the audience that follows directly on to what you're talking about, Bettina. And that is, great opportunities for carbon sequestration exist in the United States. However, and this particularly in your area, how do you deal with issues of permanence with increased fire risk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so different methodologies have approached that in different ways. But typically when you develop a project, there is an assessment of risk, of permanence risk, and fire is one of those attributes. There can also be political risk and other potential risks to permanence. But dealing with fire in particular, typically when you develop a project, and let's say your project generates a million carbon credits, or sequesters 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year, you're not allowed to sell the million. You have reserves that are taken for different types of risk, including permanence and fire risk. And depending on how risky the location is where you're developing your carbon project, you will have a higher reserve. And so the way that some methodologies or registries deal with that is they create a reserve account. Every project that's developed contributes to that reserve account. And if there is a fire or another involuntary reversal, then the system is made whole by retiring or withdrawing a commensurate number of credits. So that's how fire risk is addressed. And there's slight differences in different methodologies, but that would be sort of one of the, it would be something like that, so that you would definitely keep the system whole if fire risk has reversed credits that have been sold out of the system.
Okay, thanks, Bettina. So Keith, large corporations that aren't in our side of the business, in increasing numbers, are making public commitments to reaching net zero carbon emissions by specified dates. So will this emerging carbon-focused demand for timberland change the management of private commercial forest in the coming decade?
Bob, I would say definitely. When you look at net zero commitments, they've really been increasing dramatically in the last few years. If you go back to 2019, there was around 500 large corporations that had committed to reaching net zero over a specific amount of time. In 2020, that had risen to about 1,500. So a major increase. And I think that sort of rate of increase is actually gaining momentum. McKinsey, in the study they did, estimated that the demand for carbon credits could be increasing by a factor of 15 between now and 2030. So that's a tremendous amount of new demand that's going to be supporting carbon values, that's going to be really looking for supporting real focus on carbon focused projects on forests. And that's going to open up really new tiers of value to timberland owners, and it's going to really expand management options on timberland, on forests. Timberland owners are going to need to balance the expected value of what they could be producing through traditional commercial timber production compared to the value of capturing and storing carbon. Timberland owners are going to have to determine their optimum management plans for any particular property, considering how these timberland assets can meet their corporate, environmental, social, governance, ESG objectives, as well as how they contributed to their financial returns. So as the values generated by growing timber for carbon capture is going to be really sort of affecting how they're going to be looking at their forests for timber production. And that really is going to shift how they're going to be operating those forests. So you can be definitely seeing extended rotations, really pushing out sort of harvest to maximize carbon capture. And it could be also affecting the actual species that they plant. So not necessarily focusing on planting species that are going to be producing particular products like lumber or plywood, but really focusing on what's going to be the most maximizing way to sequester carbon. And the increasing number of corporate investors focused on carbon value could also boost demand for a wider range of forest types in a broader variety of regions, and really sort of move large-scale investment in forest lands outside of the core commercial timberland regions in the U.S. South and in the U.S. West that had traditionally been really the focus of large institutional investors like Manulife.
Okay, great. I think you answered one of the questions we had in the chat room about the difference of planting density in the South versus the Pacific Northwest. So I think you handled that one very well. Thanks, Keith. Jacek, how do you communicate information about environmental benefits of forestry projects to corporate investors? Is there a rating system developed for that purpose, which is similar to, for example, ratings by S&P, Moody's, or Fitch?
Thank you, Bob. So I think, again, I already mentioned that there is a gap between sort of asset management side and what are the real environmental impacts of certain projects. And I think, especially portfolio managers have more projects. They would like to have a more streamlined or straightforward way trying to communicate the environmental quality or the environmental impact of the portfolio that they have. I have seen several efforts trying to develop systems of information or rankings that will help to achieve that goal, but I think we still have some work to do.
Okay, any follow up from Keith? Go right ahead, sir.
Yeah, I would just sort of toss in there that you are seeing, larger corporations really getting out there and putting out annual sustainability reports that really go beyond intentions and really sort of focus on actual metrics. And I know that, that's one of the things that we do at our Manulife Timberland and Agriculture Group. We put out an annual report that really has metrics in terms of, what we're doing in terms of water quality, what we're doing about, sort of community benefits for our operations in rural areas, our sort of diversity measures. So, I think that this is also sort of tied in with the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, where you're actually looking at really imposing sort of standards out there for publicly traded firms to really deliver on metric-based reporting on these what can be sort of soft measures out there. Bettina,
Okay.
maybe you'd like to comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, you're absolutely right, Keith. I think that impact reports are becoming sort of de rigueur, and I think that the sort of UN principles of sustainable development is often a guiding sort of organizational framework for that. But I think responding also to some of the questions in the chat, the other thing that's very useful is third-party certifications and the emerging standards, Keith, that you were just referring to. And in terms of third-party certification, there's a variety of them, both on the investment side and the forestry side. For EFM, we are an FSC certified manager. So FSC is the Forest Certification Council that has been around for 30 years or so and is a global gold standard for good forestry. And in that certification standard, you actually have boots on the ground, from independent auditors every year, ensuring that your practices correspond to those of well-managed forests. In addition to that, there are a number of impact certification systems that have emerged as well that address sort of your compliance with impact goals. GEARS, GIIRS, has a certification system. EFM is part of a Impact 50, so it's evaluated as one of the top 50 impact funds in the world, by, again, an independent body. In addition, this is related to other environmental goals. There's B Corp, which evaluates, compliance with ESG at a corporate level. So there are, and that's just scratching the surface. So I would just also just underline the importance of participating in helping to build and reporting on those sort of third-party certification standards across the board, covering both forestry and corporate and impact practices, to create a common vocabulary and to build trust in sort of this emerging field of reporting on impact measures, as some of the regulatory and disclosure aspects. I know there are SEC and IRS and other agency developing sort of agency reporting on some of those things as well. But as those develop, I think these private third-party certification systems are a really important part of building this reporting infrastructure and integrity in these results on the impact side.
Thanks, Bettina and Keith, for that. We're at about the 10-minute warning now. So I see one question that is really, I think, important for all three of you. And that is, given the new net zero demand push, and we've talked about some of the dynamics of that. How much land in the United States is viable for afforestation and reforestation to generate credits? Please comment on the supply side of our equation. So if we talk about, selling all these credits, how many can we sell? So anybody, Tina, Keith, Jacek, just jump in on this question.
It's a very good question. I love the question. I'm hoping the economist in the room will perhaps have the answer to what is the total size of the market. But I really loved, Keith, your comment that the presence of carbon markets and the presence of demand is going to create demand for growing forests, enhancing forests that are currently sort of non-commercial. And I think afforestation, reforestation is a part of that. I think that most of the reforestation and afforestation efforts that I've seen to date have been in sort of Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, sort of places, where there were former forests that were converted for agriculture. And so I think that's where some of those efforts have been focused. I have not seen, and I think it's an excellent question, like what is the maximum potential? And, we have to be careful with afforestation versus reforestation. Afforestation is planting a forest where it did not exist previously. And there's all sorts of implications there for water tables, for agricultural production, for displacement of other important, sort of like prairie ecosystems. So I think that one, you have to be a little bit cautious. Reforesting areas that were previously reforested is potentially very exciting. So converting, there are plenty of degraded landscapes, across this country, not just in the Amazon, that could sustain forests again. So I'm really excited by that question, and I wish I could tell you exactly how many acres or hectares and how many tons that could produce. But I will turn it over to Keith for that response.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Bettina. It's a hugely interesting question and one that is very complicated. And I think part of it is not only just looking at what potentially could be planted with land, with trees, but it also sort of takes in, you have to step back and look at sort of the underlying policy. What is actually, as we look forward, going to qualify for a carbon credit? And right now you are seeing efforts to sort of like differentiate between, basically avoided greenhouse gas emissions versus actually removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So the idea of sort of avoiding deforestation might be sort of less acceptable, less registered than actually sort of afforestation or planting something new that's going to really remove greenhouse gases and reduce the existing sort of volumes of greenhouse gases out there. So that differentiation of what that definition of an acceptable carbon credit is could have major implications. Another is the competition between those competing land uses, between agricultural production versus forestry. And I know all of us, I think, can remember the Conservation Reserve Program that really had major implications for land use changes, the sort of concerted policy and subsidies to really move marginal agricultural lands out of agricultural production into conservation or forestry. And that was one of the key things that resulted in that major sort of boost and expansion in timber inventories and production in the US South. So policy can be a major sort of have major implications into defining what is sort of an acceptable lands for carbon production, carbon capture and storage, and what are the sort of financial incentives to do that. So I would say that in general, when we look at the United States, I think that there are definite limits. There's going to be competition for those potentially carbon-focused projects with commercial timber production. And right now, the carbon prices for carbon projects are basically sort of under $20 a ton. There's no way that you could really compete with those carbon values just on a financial basis with commercial timber production in the US South, in the West, in the inland. When you look at other regions that are less commercial timber focused, like the Northeast, the Lake States, some of the less productive areas in the Pacific Northwest, there's possibilities. So I think that you are going to see a way of expanding that total set, but I don't think that you're going to be looking at least over the next in the 2020s for a doubling. It's going to be really sort of an increment to it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Keith. And one of the things that we see here in the U.S. South, and Bettina, you may be seeing it out in the Pacific Northwest too, is both forest land owners and ag land owners are now under pressure to convert to solar farms. Just around Athens here, I have seen forests cleared for solar farms, and I've seen ag lands converted from annual row crops to solar farms. So, that's another limiting factor that we are going to have to deal with. I'm not sure at what scale, but if we do the incremental approach, which I think is probably what is going to happen, as Keith said, we're going to have to contend with these competing energy uses from solar farms. So that's something that we didn't count on as a competing land use 20 years ago. So we've got just a few minutes left, but there's a good question in the chat room that talks about compliance markets and voluntary markets. And if those markets ever merge into a compliant system, will the people who are in voluntary markets get credit for what they have done? I know that's a very hypothetical policy related question, but Jacek or Keith or Bettina, if you could chime in on that very last question, and then we'll wrap this session up.
I can start, and then my esteemed colleagues can correct me and add in. I think what the question is addressing is a process that's underway already called harmonization, where voluntary projects around the world are now beginning the process of being harmonized into sort of the national accounting system to comply with the Paris Accord. So this is something that's happening in a lot of places to how you build in those voluntary projects into the national accounting system. Ecuador, for example, is in the process of establishing a national registry where those voluntary projects get registered and reviewed by the Ministry of Environment and become part of the national accounting system. Colombia has just instituted a internal regulatory market that is also incorporating those voluntary systems. So I think those are processes that are happening in different places. And so, yes, I do see that process. It's complex. In general, those processes are incorporating the voluntary projects that exist in a variety of different ways. And so let me just take a quick little deviation to respond to Keith's comment and your comment about competing interests for different land uses, and just make a statement about where I am in the Pacific Northwest, where you have forests that are currently being managed for rotations of 35 to 40 years, but that can quite happily be quite productive into 60, 70, 80 years and beyond.
Yeah.
And so I think there are actually tremendous opportunities to manage forests in a different way that continue to produce timber and non-timber products, all the products we need, while significantly increasing their store of carbon. So I just wanted to provide a counterpoint to that comment. So over to you.
Okay, thanks. Keith, any wind-up comments? We're
No,
running.
I totally agree with Bettina in terms of the sort of move to standardization and harmonization across the different voluntary carbon markets. And I think that moving in that direction actually makes those markets more transparent and really brings added liquidity to that idea of carbon values moving forward, which really should encourage and accelerate, the capital flows out there to carbon projects.
Thank you, Keith. And thanks to our panel today, you've been Jacek, Keith, we've spent a lot of time preparing for this, and I think from what I can tell, it's paid off. We've got some fantastic questions from our audience, and thank you to the audience members for being so thoughtful and presenting the questions in a way that the old guy like me can understand. And I'd like to remind you that this entire session will continue, not our session, but the conference will continue tomorrow and kick off at 9 a.m. Central European time. And thanks to Warren and his fantastic team for helping us handle the technology and be able to speak to you today. And I want to thank everyone for participating and say goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.